Good morning, good morning. It's a beautiful day to read our story. And today we are going to be reading about Sleeping Beauty. Let's get into the story. She was sleeping and she was beautiful. Once upon a time, there lived a king and a queen who were very happy, except for one thing. They both longed to have children, but they had none. Now it happened one day when the queen had been bathing that a frog crept out of the water and spoke to her. It said, "Ribbit, ribbit, my queen, before a year has gone by, you shall have a daughter." The queen was delighted and she hurried to tell her husband the good news. Within the year, it happened as the frog had said. A baby daughter was born to the king and the queen, and they were filled with joy. The child was so pretty that everyone who came to see her cried, "What a beautiful baby! Coo, coo, coo!" They cooed over the baby. The king was so proud of his baby daughter that he ordered a wonderful christening feast to be prepared. The king invited all his friends to the feast, as well as kings, queens, princes, and princesses from other kingdoms. Some good fairies lived in the land, and the king wanted them to be godmothers to his daughter. Now there were 13 fairies in his kingdom, but one was very old, and no one had seen her for many years. As the king only had 12 golden plates, he invited just 12 of the fairies to come to the christening feast. The old fairy wasn't invited. When the christening feast was over, the fairies went up to the princess to give her their magical gifts. The first fairy said, "You shall have a beautiful face." The second fairy said, "You shall think beautiful thoughts." The third fairy said, "You shall be kind." The fourth fairy said, "You shall dance like a fairy." The fifth fairy said, "You shall sing like a nightingale." When 11 of the fairies had given their gifts, the baby had been promised everything in the world one could wish for. At that moment, the 13th fairy arrived. She was furious that the king had not invited her to the feast. Pointing to the baby, she cried in a loud voice, "When the king's daughter is 15 years old, she shall prick herself with a spindle and fall down dead." Without another word, she rushed out of the palace. All the people at the christening feast were silent with horror when they heard the words of the wicked fairy. The queen began to cry, and the king did not know how to comfort her. Then the 12th good fairy, who had not yet given the baby her gift, stepped forward. "Do not weep, dear queen. I shall do what I can to help. I cannot undo the evil spell, but I can soften it a little," she said. "The princess will prick herself with a spindle," went on the 12th fairy, "but she shall not die. She will fall into a deep sleep that will last for 100 years." The king thanked the fairy for her kindness, yet he did not want to think of his child sleeping for 100 years. So he gave orders that every spindle in the whole kingdom should be burned. His messengers were sent to every town and village to see that this was done. As time went on, the baby princess grew into a lovely girl. All the gifts that the good fairies had promised were hers. She had a beautiful face. She thought beautiful thoughts. She danced like a fairy, sang like a nightingale. She was happy, kind, and loving, so that all who knew her loved her too. The king and queen loved their daughter greatly. Now it happened that on a very day when the princess was 15 years old, the king and queen were not at home. To amuse herself, the girl wandered all over the palace. She opened the doors and of the dozens of rooms that she had never seen before. At last she came to an old tower. She climbed up the narrow winding staircase and found a little door at the top. She turned the rusty key in the lock and the door opened. There in the little room sat an old woman at her spinning wheel, busily spinning flax. Good day, good dame. What are you doing? Said the princess. I am spinning, my child, said the old lady. Oh, how wonderful! Please let me try, cried the princess. No sooner had the princess touched the spindle than the fairy's wicked words came true. She pricked her finger. As soon as she pricked her finger, the princess fell upon the bed in a deep sleep. The old woman fell asleep in her chair, and every other living creature within the palace also fell asleep. At that very moment, the king and queen returned home for their daughter's birthday. They fell asleep in the great hall of the palace. The ladies and the lords who were with them also fell asleep nearby. In the stables, the horses fell asleep. In the courtyard, the dogs stopped barking and fell asleep. On the roof, the pigeons stopped cooing and fell asleep. On the palace walls, the flies stopped crawling and fell asleep. In the kitchen, the fire died out and the meat stopped cooking. The cook fell asleep. The cook fell asleep, and so did the scullery boy. The whole palace became silent. Not a living creature moved. The winds dropped, and on the trees in the palace garden not a leaf stirred. A hedge of thorns sprang up around the palace and its gardens. Every year the hedge grew thicker and thicker and thicker. At last it grew so tall that it almost hid the palace. Only the topmost towers could be seen above. The story of the beautiful princess who lay asleep spread throughout the kingdom and far beyond. She became known as Sleeping Beauty. From time to time, many princes journeyed to the palace hoping to awaken Sleeping Beauty. But the thorn hedge had grown so quickly that none of the princes could force his way through it. It was also very thick. After many years, a very handsome prince visited the kingdom. An old man told this prince the tale of Sleeping Beauty. When the prince heard the old man's words, he said, I must waken. When the prince heard the old man's tale, he said, I must awaken this beautiful princess by myself. Now it happened that the very day on which the prince arrived was exactly 100 years after Sleeping Beauty had fallen asleep. The evil spell of the wicked fairy had come to its end. As the prince began to push against the hedge of thorns, every thorn turned into a lovely rose. The hedge opened of its own accord to let him pass through, and as he passed, the hedge of roses gently closed again behind him. The prince was spellbound as he made his way right through the flowery hedge. At last he came to the courtyard, where the dogs lay sleeping. The prince wandered into the stables, and there he found the horses all standing asleep. Not a sound was to be heard in the whole of the palace. Next, the prince went into the palace kitchen. The cook and the kitchen maid were asleep, the fire was out, and the meat was half cooked. The prince walked further into the silent palace. There the king and the queen sat asleep on their thrones. All was so quiet that the prince felt he could walk on tiptoes. The prince wandered along the corridors. He looked in all the rooms he could find, but nowhere did he find Sleeping Beauty. At length, the prince came to the foot of the highest tower. He began to climb the narrow, winding staircase. When he reached the door at the top, he pushed it gently open and stepped into a small room. There, on the bed, lay the most beautiful maiden he had ever seen. For a long time he looked at her in wonder. Then he bent down and gave her a kiss. At that moment, Sleeping Beauty opened her eyes and gave the prince a wonderful smile. Then she sat up quite wide awake. The prince gave her his hand and she stood up. Together they went down the narrow, winding staircase along the corridors, down the main staircase and into the great hall. At that moment, the king and the queen woke up from their sleep. They were overjoyed to see their daughter awake and well, and they welcomed the prince who had broken the spell. Then the lords and the ladies in the great hall awakened, and the whole palace began to stir. Everybody woke up. In the kitchen, the fire began to burn, and the meat began to cook. The meat began to cook. The meat is 100 years old. Good gracious. In the courtyard, the dogs awakened and began to bark. In the stables, the horses were stirring, and the pigeons on the roof awakened and flew away. The palace had come again to life after its sleep of 100 years. Everyone in the palace was both astonished and delighted. Around the palace, the high hedge of thorns vanished. A wonderful wedding feast was prepared. The handsome prince was married to Sleeping Beauty, and they lived happily ever after. The end. I love that story about Sleeping Beauty. You always have to say, it's a beautiful day to read a story. Yes, a beautiful day, a beautiful day, a beautiful day to read a story.